Masan emerged. It was supposed to be another flawless royal celebration inside the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace until King Charles abruptly halted the honors process after shocking details about one recipient began circulating through palace corridors. Courtiers reportedly exchanged nervous glances, aides disappeared behind closed doors, and what unfolded next threatened to ignite one of the most humiliating scandals of Charles's reign. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace that morning had reportedly been one of absolute confidence. Senior royals, decorated military officials, and longtime palace advisors moved through the grand ceremonial rooms with the kind of polished precision the monarchy had perfected over generations. Everything about the event was designed to project continuity, stability, and dignity at a moment when King Charles was already facing enormous pressure surrounding his reign, his health, and growing public scrutiny toward the institution itself. Reports suggest the honors recipient at the center of the ceremony had initially been celebrated by palace officials as a model figure, someone presented as embodying service, commitment, and loyalty to the nation. For weeks, preparations had quietly moved forward without disruption. Invitations were finalized. Background briefings were approved. The machinery of the palace appeared fully aligned. But according to several royal insiders, something changed only hours before the formal proceedings were expected to begin. It is now whispered in the highest circles of royal administration that troubling allegations connected to recipients' past began surfacing through private communications that rapidly triggered panic behind the scenes. At first, some aides allegedly dismissed the concerns as little more than online speculation. However, the situation reportedly escalated after additional information reached senior palace staff through channels insiders described as impossible to ignore. That was the moment the mood inside Buckingham Palace shifted from celebration to quiet alarm. Different interpretations of the timeline describe an almost immediate scramble among advisors once the information reached key officials. Palace administrative streams, ranging from private secret IR to communications teams, allegedly moved into emergency containment discussions as confusion spread throughout the building. Reports suggest several staff members were instructed to avoid discussing the situation entirely, while others were suddenly pulled from ceremonial preparations and redirected into urgent meetings. One former royal correspondent claimed the atmosphere inside the palace became extraordinarily tense, with aides reportedly fearing that the monarchy was about to walk directly into a public relations disaster unfolding in real time. And at the center of it all stood King Charles himself. Sources close to palace operations suggest the king may have been informed only minutes before final authorization surrounding the honor was expected to proceed. That detail alone has reportedly triggered enormous concern among royal observers because it raises deeply uncomfortable questions about how such serious allegations could have escaped earlier scrutiny. Some insiders claim Charles appeared visibly frustrated after receiving the briefing, while others suggest the monarch was more concerned about what the revelation symbolized for the integrity of the institution her than the individual recipient alone. Why, many within palace circles reportedly asked, had the warning signs not been taken seriously sooner, and perhaps even more damaging, who exactly failed to act when concerns first emerged? Those questions only intensified as media insiders began hinting that this may not have been the first time concerns surrounding the honoree had quietly circulated within influential circles. Reports suggest certain palace figures may have previously received warnings tied to the recipient's background but failed to escalate them aggressively enough before the situation reached crisis level. If true, then, the implications could prove devastating because the British honours system has long been presented as one of the monarchy's most carefully protected traditions, a symbol of trust, prestige, and national recognition. The idea that such a process could potentially be compromised by oversight, internal hesitation, or bureaucratic failure immediately transformed what should have been a celebratory royal moment into something far darker. As the story began leaking beyond palace walls, nervous conversations reportedly spread among royal commentators, journalists, and our staff members who understood just how sensitive this kind of scandal could become for a monarchy already navigating a fragile public image. Every delayed statement, every unexplained movement by senior aides, every sudden shift in palace scheduling only fueled further speculation that the crisis unfolding behind closed doors was far more serious than officials initially hoped to admit. And the deeper reporters began digging into the background of the suspended recipient, the more alarming the broader picture allegedly became. But the real crisis wasn't simply who received the honor, it was how the palace failed to uncover the truth before the entire nation saw it unfold. For decades, the royal honors system was presented as untouchable, a fortress of scrutiny, discretion, and elite vetting. But insiders now whisper that this scandal exposed alarming cracks in a process once considered one of Britain's most guarded institutions. The deeper the controversy spread across Britain, the more uncomfortable questions began surfacing about the machinery hidden beneath the glittering image of royal recognition. For generations, the honors system had been portrayed as something almost sacred within the structure of the monarchy itself. Knighthoods, royal medals, distinguished appointments, these were not supposed to be handed out casually or recklessly. Reports suggest every candidate traditionally passed through layers of investigation, advisory committees, government reviews, and private assessments long before their name ever reached the monarch's desk. That process was designed to project absolute confidence to the public. It reassured the nation that anyone standing before the king had been thoroughly examined, their history carefully weighed, and their reputation deemed worthy of royal endorsement. But now, according to palace insiders and royal commentators alike, that confidence was beginning to fracture under intense public scrutiny. What made the scandal especially dangerous was the growing perception that this failure had not happened suddenly. Different interpretations emerging from within royal circles suggest concerns tied to the recipient may have existed long before the ceremony itself. Sources familiar with administrative procedures reportedly claim fragments of troubling information had circulated quietly among officials months earlier, but no decisive action was taken at the time. Some insiders insist the allegations were initially viewed as unreliable or unsubstantiated, while others suggest certain staff members simply underestimated the potential damage if those details ever became public. Either way, the result now appeared catastrophic. The palace was no longer merely defending one controversial decision, it was defending the credibility of the entire institution behind it. That realization reportedly triggered deep divisions behind closed doors. According to multiple royal correspondents, senior staff members involved in the approval process had not been fully united over the recipient's inclusion from the very beginning. Some allegedly argued that aspects of the individual's background required closer examination before any honor moved forward. Others reportedly believed delaying or questioning the nomination could create unnecessary complications or political tensions. As the scandal intensified, those internal disagreements allegedly transformed into quiet blame games spreading throughout palace administration. Questions that once remained confined to private discussions were suddenly becoming impossible to see, contain. Who reviewed the file? Who signed off on the recommendation? And perhaps most explosively of all, who ignored the warnings? Royal commentators quickly began describing the unfolding controversy as an institutional embarrassment, not simply because of the allegations themselves, but because the scandal appeared to expose weaknesses inside a system the monarchy had spent decades presenting as nearly flawless. Comparisons soon emerged to earlier royal controversies involving disputed honors, questionable appointments, and titles that later became sources of public regret. Historians and media figures pointed toward previous moments when the palace faced criticism for associating too closely with figures whose reputations later collapsed under scrutiny. But insiders claim this controversy felt different. Why? Because it arrived during one of the most fragile periods of King Charles's reign, a time already overshadowed by health concerns, institutional pressure, and growing debates about the monarchy's future relevance in modern Britain. The timing could hardly have been worse. Reports suggest Charles had been attempting to reinforce the image of a stable, disciplined monarchy from Hassan emerged focused on service and accountability. Instead, this scandal threatened to create the exact opposite impression. Confusion, internal dysfunction, and possible negligence at the highest levels of royal administration. Palace officials reportedly understood the danger immediately. If the public began believing the honors system itself could no longer be trusted, the damage would extend far beyond a single suspended recognition. It would strike directly at one of the monarchy's oldest tools of national influence and prestige. As journalists continued investigating the recipient's background, additional reports allegedly surfaced pointing toward private complaints that may have been raised months before the ceremony ever took place. Some claims suggested concerns were quietly filed through administrative channels, but never escalated aggressively enough to stop the process. Others hinted that fear of political embarrassment may have discouraged tougher scrutiny earlier on. And with every new revelation, the atmosphere surrounding Buckingham Palace reportedly grew heavier, more defensive, and increasingly chaotic. Because behind the carefully worded statements and polished public silence, a more troubling question was beginning to emerge. Was this simply an isolated mistake or evidence of a deeper institutional failure hidden within the monarchy itself? And as journalists began digging deeper into the recipient's history, an even more troubling narrative reportedly emerged behind the scenes. What began as scattered online whispers quickly transformed into a national storm after buried details from the recipient's past resurfaced details palace officials allegedly feared could permanently stain the monarchy's credibility. At first, the allegations moved quietly through obscure online forums and fragmented social media discussions, dismissed by some royal loyalists as another wave of internet speculation targeting the crown. But within hours, the situation reportedly escalated beyond anything Buckingham Palace had anticipated. Old interviews began resurfacing. Archived statements reappeared. Alleged associations connected to controversial figures and deeply troubling accusations suddenly flooded public discussion with astonishing speed. What had initially seemed manageable was now spiraling into something far more dangerous, a crisis no longer confined to Palace C, Adoradors, but exploding directly into the national conversation. Reports suggest royal aides were caught completely off guard by how rapidly the controversy gained momentum. Every attempt to contain the story appeared to trigger even greater public curiosity. Journalists, commentators, and online investigators began combing through years of digital records, uncovering fragments of the recipient's past that critics claimed should have raised concerns long before any royal recognition was approved. Some of the allegations reportedly involved controversial affiliations dating back years, while other resurfaced material painted a deeply uncomfortable picture for palace officials already struggling to defend the integrity of the honors process. Whether every accusation was accurate became almost secondary to the larger problem now facing the monarchy itself: perception. And perception, insiders feared, was turning catastrophic. Social media only intensified the pressure. What once might have remained buried inside newspaper columns or late-night political debate programs suddenly became impossible to contain in the modern digital era. Millions of people were now examining the story in awe, bereft, every time sharing screenshots, resurfacing clips, and questioning how an individual surrounded by so much controversy had come so close to receiving one of the nation's highest distinctions. Royal commentators described the backlash as relentless. With every passing hour, outrage expanded beyond criticism of the recipient alone and toward the institution responsible for approving them. The monarchy, once viewed by supporters as disciplined and meticulous, was suddenly being portrayed by critics as careless, disconnected, and alarmingly vulnerable to internal failure. Inside Buckingham Palace, reports suggest officials entered what several royal correspondents described as full damage control mode. Emergency meetings allegedly continued late into the evening as communications advisors attempted to contain the growing storm. Senior aides were reportedly instructed to reassess public statements, monitor escalating reaction online, and prepare for the possibility of additional revelations still waiting to emerge. But according to insiders familiar with the atmosphere behind closed doors, panic was already beginning to spread among palace staff. The deeper journalists dug into the story. The more officials feared there could be other warning signs buried inside internal records, warnings that, if proven true, would only deepen accusations of institutional negligence. The public response quickly became unforgiving. Questions flooded media coverage across Britain. How had this happened? Who approved the nomination? Why had earlier concerns allegedly failed to stop the process before it reached the king himself? Those questions struck directly at the monarchy's carefully maintained image of order and competence. Royal historians and commentators began drawing comparisons to previous scandals involving controversial honors, disputed royal associations, and public relations disasters that haunted the institution for years afterward. But many insiders reportedly believed this controversy carried a uniquely dangerous edge because it arrived during a period when public trust in traditional institutions was already weakening. The palace was no longer merely fighting criticism, it was fighting the perception that it had become disconnected from the standards it once demanded of everyone else. And at the center of the storm stood King Charles. Reports suggest the monarch B. When Princess Anne emerged, came deeply frustrated as the fallout intensified, particularly as criticism shifted from administrative failure toward broader questions about his leadership during a fragile moment in his reign. Sources close to palace operations claim Charles viewed the scandal as both humiliating and deeply damaging to the crown's authority. Some insiders even whispered that the king felt personally betrayed by the officials responsible for overseeing the vetting process. After all, the monarchy depended not only on ceremony and tradition, but on public confidence that the institution still operated with discipline, caution, and moral judgment. Once that confidence began cracking, the danger became far greater than any single scandal. And as pressure mounted outside the palace gates, an even darker fear reportedly began spreading inside royal circles themselves. Because behind the public outrage, behind the endless headlines and growing criticism, officials allegedly understood the real threat now facing the monarchy. Yet inside the palace, the greatest fear wasn't public outrage, it was the growing perception that the monarchy itself had lost control. Then came the moment that reportedly stunned. Amid even veteran palace staff, King Charles personally intervened, suspending the honor in a move insiders described as swift, ruthless, and deeply symbolic. For days, Buckingham Palace had reportedly operated under a cloud of growing panic as outrage intensified across Britain. Every hour seemed to bring fresh scrutiny, new accusations, and mounting questions surrounding how the controversy had reached the highest levels of royal approval. Palace aides allegedly feared the monarchy was drifting toward a dangerous tipping point where silence itself would begin looking like complicity. And according to sources familiar with internal discussions, that was precisely the moment King Charles decided the crisis could no longer be managed quietly behind closed doors. The monarch, insiders claim, understood something many within the institution had initially underestimated. Public confidence in the crown was beginning to erode in real time. Reports suggest Charles ordered an immediate review of the honor after receiving updated briefings. Surrounding the scale of the backlash and the resurfacing allegations connected to the recipient's past. What shocked many inside royal circles was not the decision itself, but the speed at which it unfolded. Traditionally, matters involving royal honors and public controversy often moved cautiously through layers of legal review, administrative consultation, and carefully negotiated statements. But this time, according to royal commentators, the response came with unusual urgency. Veteran palace figures reportedly described the atmosphere as tense and uncompromising, with Charles determined to project authority before the crisis spiraled even further beyond the palace's control. Emergency meetings were allegedly convened almost immediately. Palace legal advisors, constitutional experts, communications officials, and senior courtiers reportedly gathered behind closed doors as discussions intensified over how to contain the damage. Sources claim the central concern was no longer the individual recipient alone, but the survival of the monarchy's credibility itself. The phrase "protecting the integrity of the crown" reportedly became the guiding principle behind the king's intervention. Insiders suggest Charles viewed the suspension not simply as a disciplinary action, but as a necessary signal to the public that the monarchy stood. Hassan emerged, "I possess the ability to act decisively when its standards were called into question." But even as the palace moved to suspend the honor, internal anxiety reportedly deepened. Some officials allegedly feared the decision could trigger even greater scrutiny into how the nomination process functioned behind the scenes. Others worried it would encourage journalists and political critics to revisit older controversies involving royal titles, appointments, and honors that had previously faded from public attention. There was also growing concern surrounding Charles's reign itself. Since ascending the throne, the king had reportedly worked carefully to present himself as a stabilizing figure during an era of uncertainty for the monarchy. Yet now, insiders whispered that this scandal threatened to become one of the defining crises of his early reign, a test not only of leadership but of institutional survival. Royal commentators quickly noted how unusually forceful the response appeared. Some described it as one of the fastest interventions connected to a royal honor in recent memory. Others interpreted the suspension as a sign that Charles recognized the immense reputational danger molding around him. Reports suggest the king became increasingly frustrated by suggestions that palace officials had ignored warning signs earlier in the process. According to insiders, Charles was determined to avoid appearing passive or indecisive while criticism intensified from both the media and the public. In many ways, the monarch reportedly understood that hesitation would only deepen perceptions that the institution had lost its grip over the systems designed to protect it. Yet, even as the suspension temporarily slowed the immediate backlash, it also opened an entirely new and potentially more explosive chapter inside Buckingham Palace. Questions reportedly began circulating among aides and royal observers about whether this controversy could expose deeper problems hidden within the honor's structure itself. If one approval process had allegedly failed so publicly, critics asked, could others also come under scrutiny? Some insiders feared the palace had entered dangerous territory where every past decision, every controversial appointment, and every overlooked warning might now be re-examined under an unforgiving spotlight, and that possibility reportedly sent waves of nervousness through the institution. Because by the time Charles acted, the scandal had already evolved into something far larger than one suspended recognition. It had become a public reckoning over trust, accountability, and whether the monarchy still possessed the discipline it claimed to embody. Inside the palace, officials allegedly understood the stakes with chilling clarity. The crown could survive criticism. It could survive scandal. But surviving the perception of institutional weakness was something far more uncertain. But suspending the honor was only the beginning, because the fallout soon spread far beyond a single recipient. Behind palace walls, the scandal reportedly triggered weeks of panic, finger-pointing, and silent warfare between royal aides desperate to avoid blame for a catastrophe now dominating headlines across Britain. What had once been treated as a manageable controversy was now evolving into a full institutional crisis, and according to insiders, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace became increasingly toxic as pressure mounted from every direction. Senior officials who had previously projected calm professionalism were suddenly facing accusations of negligence behind closed doors. Reports suggest private meetings grew tense, emotional, and at times openly confrontational as competing factions within palace administration attempted to distance themselves from the scandal before further revelations emerged. The sense of order the monarchy depended on was beginning to fracture under the weight of suspicion, fear, and mutual distrust. Sources familiar with the situation claim one of the most damaging developments came when internal reviews into the honor's vetting procedures were quietly launched. What initially appeared to be a straightforward response to public outrage allegedly transformed into something far more uncomfortable for those inside the institution. Every stage of the approval process reportedly came under scrutiny. Who reviewed the recipient's file? Which officials handled background checks? When were concerns first raised internally? And perhaps most dangerously of all, why were earlier warnings allegedly allowed to fade into silence without decisive intervention? Those questions reportedly sent waves of anxiety through senior palace offices, because the answers threatened to expose vulnerabilities the monarchy had spent decades insisting did not exist. At the same time, anonymous leaks reportedly began appearing across British tabloids with startling frequency. Royal correspondents suddenly received private details about internal disagreements, emergency meetings, and behind-the-scenes frustrations that would normally remain hidden from public view. Some insiders allegedly described a growing culture of quiet betrayal unfolding within palace walls, where aides fearful for their own reputations began feeding information to journalists in an effort to shift blame elsewhere. Every new headline only intensified the pressure. One day, the focus centered on administrative failures. The next, speculation turned toward divisions among senior royal advisors themselves. According to commentators, the palace no longer appeared unified, it appeared defensive, reactive, and increasingly overwhelmed. Public confidence in royal institutions also began suffering visible damage. Across television debates, newspaper columns, and social media discussions, critics questioned whether the monarchy's traditional systems were still capable of functioning effectively in a modern era defined by relentless scrutiny and instant exposure. The scandal no longer felt isolated. Instead, it became symbolic of broader concerns surrounding accountability, transparency, and whether ancient institutions could still adapt fast enough to survive contemporary public expectations. Royal historians reportedly drew comparisons to earlier public relations disasters that shook the monarchy during previous decades, moments where hesitation, secrecy, or institutional arrogance only deepened the crisis instead of containing it. And for many observers, those comparisons carried chilling implications for Charles's reign. Because this controversy arrived at an already fragile time for the king himself, reports suggest Charles had hoped to stabilize the monarchy through a more disciplined and modern image after years of turbulence surrounding the royal family. Yet now, critics argued, the scandal appeared to reveal the opposite. Outdated procedures, communication failures, and internal confusion unfolding at the heart of the institution. Pressure reportedly intensified on Charles to modernize palace systems more aggressively, particularly regarding how honors, appointments, and sensitive vetting processes were managed. Some inside, and dares even claimed younger advisors pushed for sweeping reforms behind the scenes, fearing public trust could continue deteriorating unless visible changes were introduced quickly. The emotional toll inside royal circles reportedly became increasingly difficult to hide. Sources suggest several members of the royal family grew deeply frustrated by the ongoing embarrassment surrounding the scandal and the endless cycle of damaging headlines dominating British media. Every attempt to contain the controversy seemed to produce another leak, another accusation, or another painful question about how such a failure had been allowed to happen. According to palace insiders, the fear was no longer simply about reputational damage, it was about the long-term survival of authority itself. The monarchy could withstand criticism. It had survived crises before. But what frightened officials most was the growing belief among the public that the institution might no longer be fully in control of its own systems. And as that perception spread, the scandal continued evolving into something far more dangerous than a single administrative failure. It became a symbol of uncertainty surrounding the future of monarchy under Charles's leadership. Inside Buckingham Palace, aides reportedly understood the stakes with increasing urgency. Because once doubts surrounding competence begin taking root inside public consciousness, reversing them becomes extraordinarily difficult. And with every passing day, the pressure surrounding the king only intensified further. And as the institution struggled to contain the damage, many began asking a far more dangerous question. Could this scandal define Charles's reign? For King Charles, the controversy arrived at the worst possible moment, a reign already burdened by health concerns, internal tensions, and growing public skepticism now faced another destabilizing blow. By the time the scandal reached its peak, the pressure surrounding the king had reportedly become immense. What should have been a carefully managed period of continuity for the monarchy was instead unfolding under a cloud of uncertainty, controversy, and emotional exhaustion. Reports suggest Charles had already been navigating one of the most difficult chapters of his public life, balancing the demands of the crown while facing deeply personal health challenges behind closed doors. Every public appearance, every official engagement, every carefully measured statement now carried additional weight because the nation was no longer simply watching a monarch perform ceremonial duties. It was watching a king attempting to hold together an institution many believed was entering an increasingly fragile era. Inside palace circles, insiders reportedly feared the honors scandal had struck directly at the monarchy's most vulnerable point. The controversy did not emerge during a period of strength or stability. It arrived while questions surrounding the future of the institution were already intensifying across Britain. Critics of the monarchy used the scandal to argue that the royal system itself had become outdated, unaccountable, and disconnected from modern expectations. Anti-monarchy voices reportedly seized on the chaos as evidence that centuries-old traditions could no longer operate effectively in an era where information moved instantly and public scrutiny never disappeared. Meanwhile, even many loyal supporters of the crown privately admitted concern over how damaging the controversy had become. The emotional contradictions surrounding Charles only deepened the pain. Public reaction. Some viewed the king with sympathy, believing he had inherited an impossible burden during a period of institutional turbulence few monarchs could fully control. Others, however, questioned whether his reign had responded forcefully enough to modern challenges facing the monarchy. Reports suggest commentators increasingly debated whether Charles's leadership style, often described as thoughtful, cautious, and deeply traditional, was equipped for an era demanding speed, transparency, and decisive accountability. Those discussions reportedly unsettled palace officials because they struck at the heart of a much larger fear. The possibility that public confidence in the monarchy itself was slowly eroding. And behind closed doors, that fear allegedly became impossible to ignore. Sources claim senior palace advisors worried intensely about the long-term reputational consequences of the scandal, particularly as international headlines continued framing the controversy as evidence of institutional dysfunction. The monarchy had survived countless crises throughout history, but insiders reportedly believed modern scandals carried a different kind of danger. In previous generations, royal controversies unfolded gradually through newspapers and delayed reporting. Now, every misstep spread globally within minutes, amplified by social media, endless commentary, and relentless public analysis. Palace aides allegedly understood that perception could solidify faster than any official response could contain it. At the same time, attention quietly shifted toward Prince William and other senior royals watching events unfold from within the institution. Reports suggest William monitored the fallout closely as speculation intensified about the future direction of the monarchy under the next generation of leadership. Some royal commentators even described the scandal as an unspoken warning about the challenges William himself may one day inherit. If public trust continued weakening during Charles's reign, the burden placed upon the future king could become even heavier. That realization reportedly added another layer of tension behind palace walls, where conversations surrounding modernization, reform, and institutional survival were becoming increasingly urgent. The broader national mood also appeared deeply divided. Across Britain, public reaction reflected a mixture of frustration, exhaustion, and reluctant sympathy. Some citizens argued the palace had acted too slowly and appeared dangerously disconnected from public expectations. Others believed Charles was being unfairly blamed for failures rooted in broader administrative systems beyond his direct control. But regardless of where opinions fell, one reality had become impossible to deny. The scandal had shaken confidence in the monarchy during a moment when stability mattered more than ever. And perhaps that was what made the controversy feel so unsettling inside royal circles. It was not merely about a suspended honor or a failed vetting process anymore. It had evolved into a referendum on whether the institution could still adapt, respond, and maintain authority in an unforgiving modern world. Palace insiders reportedly understood the stakes with painful clarity, because once a monarchy begins appearing fragile rather than formidable, restoring confidence becomes extraordinarily difficult. The crown had endured wars, abdications, divorces, scandals, and public fury before, but this crisis touched something even more dangerous: belief in the institution's competence itself. But even as a tragedy intensified, palace insiders believed the crown's survival would ultimately depend on one thing above all else: accountability. Across Britain, the backlash spread rapidly from television panels to parliament discussions as critics demanded answers over how such a controversial figure came so close to royal endorsement. What began as a palace controversy had now transformed into a national reckoning. The story no longer belonged solely to royal correspondence or tabloid headlines. It consumed political debate programs, dominated newspaper front pages, and fueled endless arguments across social media platforms where public frustration intensified by the hour. Reports suggest the scale of outrage caught even seasoned palace officials off guard. Every attempt to calm the situation appeared to deepen suspicion instead. Every carefully worded statement was dissected, criticized, and questioned. And at the center of the public anger stood one painful question the palace seemed unable to escape: how had this happened at all? Across television studios and radio broadcasts, commentators openly challenged the monarchy's systems of accountability. Royal experts who had spent years defected and emerged. Nearing the end, palace traditions reportedly began acknowledging that the scandal exposed serious weaknesses within the honor structure. Some argued the institution's vetting procedures had become dangerously outdated in a modern world where public records, digital histories, and controversial associations could no longer remain hidden for long. Others suggested the palace had grown too dependent on secrecy and internal loyalty, creating an environment where difficult questions were quietly avoided until crises became unavoidable. For many observers, this was no longer simply a failure of administration. It was a warning sign about the monarchy's ability to adapt to a rapidly changing society. The pressure intensified further when politicians and public figures entered the debate. Reports suggest members of parliament privately expressed concern over the growing reputational damage surrounding the scandal, while commentators across the political spectrum demanded greater transparency regarding how royal honors were approved. Some critics questioned whether an institution tied so closely to national identity could continue relying on opaque procedures shielded from public scrutiny. others war. That failing to address the controversy decisively would only deepen cynicism toward both the monarchy and the wider establishment surrounding it. The palace suddenly found itself trapped between preserving tradition and responding to demands for accountability it could no longer easily dismiss. Meanwhile, social media transformed the controversy into something relentless and deeply emotional. Every archived interview, every resurfaced allegation, every leaked detail from anonymous insiders spread with astonishing speed. Public anger became amplified through endless speculation, viral commentary, and online investigations conducted by millions of ordinary people determined to uncover answers themselves. The monarchy's traditional advantage is its ability to manage narratives slowly and carefully. Through controlled media channels appeared to collapse under the force of the digital age. Reports suggest palace aides watched helplessly as online discourse spiraled beyond their control, turning every delay and every silence into further evidence, in the minds of critics, that something deeper was being concealed. The palace communication strategy soon faced fierce criticism of its own. Royal commentators argued officials had responded too slowly during the crucial early stages of the scandal, allowing confusion and speculation to dominate public perception before clear explanations emerged. Some insiders allegedly believed Buckingham Palace underestimated the intensity of modern public reaction, assuming the controversy could be contained quietly through traditional damage control tactics. But by the time stronger responses were issued, the scandal had already evolved into a much larger crisis about trust itself. According to commentators, the monarchy no longer appeared disciplined and composed, it appeared reactive, defensive, and increasingly overwhelmed by forces it could not fully control. As outrage intensified, pressure for accountability inside the honor system grew impossible to ignore. Reports suggest internal reviews expanded while journalists continued investigating who ultimately approved the decision and whether earlier warnings had been disregarded somewhere within palace administration. That question haunted the institution because it implied not just oversight, but potential systemic failure. And with every passing day, critics became louder in names, explanations, and consequences. The monarchy, once shielded by ceremony and distance, now faced a public demanding transparency with unprecedented intensity. For King Charles, the emotional weight of the crisis reportedly became increasingly personal. Sources close to palace operations suggest the scandal fundamentally shook his confidence in some of the systems and advisors surrounding him. After years spent trying to present a modernized monarchy rooted in service and responsibility, the controversy instead created an image of uncertainty, hesitation, and institutional vulnerability. And perhaps most damaging of all, insiders allegedly feared the scandal had permanently altered how the public viewed the crown's judgment during one of the most sensitive periods in Charles's reign. And while the palace fought to restore confidence, insiders claimed the scandal had already changed the way Charles viewed trust inside his own institution forever. In the end, this was never just about one suspended honor. It became a chilling reminder that in modern Britain, even the monarchy's most sacred traditions can unravel overnight when secrecy, reputation, and power collide. Once after the headlines began fading and the public outrage slowly lost its intensity, the shockwaves of the scandal reportedly continued echoing through Buckingham Palace. What unfolded was not merely an embarrassing controversy tied to a single individual. It exposed something far deeper and far more unsettling about the fragile relationship between the monarchy and public trust in the modern age. For generations, royal honors symbolized prestige, discipline, and national recognition carefully protected by centuries of tradition. But this scandal shattered the illusion that those systems were untouchable. Suddenly, the institution itself appeared vulnerable not to revolution or political collapse, but to its own internal failures. And insiders claim King Charles understood the danger of that perception immediately. Reports suggest the king became increasingly focused on restoring a sense of authority and stability inside the palace after weeks of chaos and scrutiny. Senior advisors allegedly recognized that allowing the controversy to define the monarchy unchecked could inflict lasting reputational damage during one of the most sensitive periods of Charles's reign. The crown had already endured years of internal tensions, public division, and endless debate surrounding its future role in British society. Another prolonged scandal risked reinforcing the idea that the institution was no longer capable of managing itself effectively. That fear reportedly drove the palace toward a far more decisive strategy in the aftermath, one centered on discipline, accountability, and visible control. Behind closed doors, discussions allegedly intensified over how the monarchy could modernize without sacrificing the traditions that gave it meaning in the first place. Palace officials reportedly understood the honors system could no longer operate exactly as it had in previous decades. Public expectations had changed. Transparency mattered more. Scrutiny moved faster. Every decision made by the institution could now be dissected globally within minutes. According to royal commentators, the scandal forced the monarchy into an uncomfortable confrontation with reality. Secrecy and silence, once considered tools of royal survival, were now increasingly viewed by the public as signs of weakness or concealment. At the same time, the symbolic weight of suspending the honor remained enormous within royal circles. For many inside the institution, the move represented far more than damage control. It became a statement about survival. Reports suggest Charles wanted the public to see that protecting the integrity of the crown mattered more than preserving appearances or shielding mistakes from scrutiny. Whether critics accepted that message entirely is another question. But insiders claim the king viewed decisive intervention as essential because hesitation could have permanently deepened perceptions that the monarchy had become detached from accountability altogether. Yet perhaps the most unsettling lesson from the scandal was how quickly royal prestige itself could be threatened in the modern era. One moment, the palace projected confidence, ceremony, and tradition. The next, it found itself engulfed by outrage, internal conflict, and public distrust spreading at extraordinary speed. That contrast reportedly shook many inside royal administration. The monarchy had spent centuries mastering symbolism, ritual, and controlled public image. But now, in an age driven by digital exposure and relentless public reaction, even the most carefully protected institutions appeared startlingly fragile. And once doubt enters public consciousness, palace insiders allegedly feared, removing it becomes nearly impossible. For Charles personally, the controversy may ultimately become remembered as one of the defining tests of his reign, not because of the suspended honor itself, but because of what it revealed about the pressures facing the monarchy in the 21st century. The burden of preserving the crown no longer depended solely on ceremony, diplomacy, or tradition. It depended on credibility, on trust, on the public belief that the institution still possessed the judgment and discipline required to justify its place in national life. And according to those close to palace operations, that realization changed the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace in ways the public may never fully see. Because beneath the polished speeches, the formal ceremonies, and the carefully choreographed appearances, the monarchy remains deeply dependent on something remarkably fragile. Belief. Belief that the institution still deserves respect. Belief that its systems still function with integrity. Belief that duty continues to outweigh privilege behind palace. Once that belief begins to crack, the danger becomes existential. And that is why this scandal resonated far beyond a single controversy or one suspended recognition. It became a warning about how rapidly trust can erode when power, secrecy, and reputation collide under public scrutiny. Because within the House of Windsor, reputations may rise in a single ceremony, but they can collapse just as quickly the moment the palace doors close behind them. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.